Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you. It's been 2 years, and very strange to be back over here again for all that time. So, recent Canadian law, Bill C-4, has forbidden so-called conversion therapy. It directly targets the so-called myth that, in the words of the bill, heterosexuality, cisgender gender identity, and gender expression that conforms to the sex assigned to a person at birth are to be preferred over other sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions. And it prohibits, again in the words of the law, practice, treatment, or service designed to alter or repress someone's non-heterosexual or non-cisgender sexuality, gender identity, or gender expression, with punishment of up to 5 years imprisonment in certain cases. So in response to this unjust and perverse law, the CRAC presiding minister, Virgil Hurt, has asked churches to speak to the social evils that it represents on this Sunday. So what I want us to think about today is how, surrounded by such injustice, such untruth, we are to respond. How do we deal with the increasingly aggressive and oppressive forms that our anti-Christian cultures are adopting? And the challenges that we face are not merely challenges of truth, challenges to truth, narrowly considered as Christian. These are challenges to reality itself. These are challenges to things that until very recently were universally accepted and uncontroversial among people of all religious persuasions or none. A more comprehensive reimagining of reality and humanity is afoot, and we might wonder why we have the misfortune to be the ones that must withstand its onslaught. But withstand we must. It's a direct attack upon reality and upon Christian conviction, and such attacks should not surprise us. These positions are fundamentally in conflict with reality itself. And as we feel the force of such direct attacks, such as this law, it's very easy to think that that is where the primary attacks are occurring, where the primary moves are occurring. And yet, they are merely one aspect of a far-reaching attack on many different fronts upon reality and Christian conviction. So we're seeing, for instance, changes to our language. If you notice the way that words like mother and father, husband and wife, man and woman are removed in certain contexts. People talk about partner instead of wife or husband. We have other terms that are gradually slipping away from our vocabulary, almost imperceptibly. Sometimes it will be a more egregious erasure when people talk about pregnant persons rather than pregnant women. Sometimes it will be something that is just a circumlocution that we don't even notice. There are also changes to representation. You may notice that in many pieces of advertising or many films, there are certain figures you just don't see that much anymore. You see, on occasions, you'll have this very pointed attack upon so-called gender stereotypes. You don't want to have any characters that portray traditional gender roles, for instance, in a positive light. You can't present having a father and a mother in any way that would present it as the norm, nor could you present having a wife and a husband in a happy marital relationship as what should be expected as the general rule. Beyond this, we're seeing changes to the structure of society. The creation of same-sex marriage being perhaps the greatest example of this, but also removal of the distinctions and divisions between men and women in various areas, from anything from toilets to sports and breaking down of single-sex groups, things like that. It can be easy to be less animated about some of these assaults and changes. At least we can say, they aren't persecuting us. Live and let live. We can understand that people want to have more accommodating, more hospitable, more generous language. We don't want to make people feel bad about themselves. Yet in many of these changes, we are seeing this fundamental assault upon reality and Christian conviction taking place, no less than in these explicit laws that directly attack and criminalize Christian and Christians speaking about and acting according to their convictions. If laws with punishments are designed to prevent people from speaking about and acting according to certain convictions, many of the changes I've just mentioned are designed to make those convictions unthinkable to rising generations. Not just to prevent them from acting according to them, but to prevent them from even thinking in those terms. The reality that we are being raised into is one in which these realities of male and female, of what it means to be related to each other, they just don't register. If laws like Bill C-4 could be compared to introducing poison into one's food, the effect of the changes that I'm describing more broadly could be compared to starving people of all the nutrients that they need for health. And my concern is that when we relate to these changes and when we react to these problems, that we do not merely take what I think of as a medicinal approach, thinking when we see this poison, when we see this error in society, that the primary response should be introducing some medicine to respond to it. What we need more than anything else as our most fundamental response is solid food, engagement with reality in its deepest form, rooting ourselves in reality, so that when these sorts of errors come along, we have the strong immune system and ability to resist them. Despite the many claims of those who present the so-called science of sexuality and the arguments that opposing viewpoints have no basis whatsoever in science, there is a great elephant in the room. Apparently, we can make sense of human sexes, human sexuality, gender, sexual relations, gender expression, all these sorts of things, without ever once needing to make reference to the reality of reproduction. But yeah, that's reality. And as we think about reality, as we root ourselves in reality, we will be able to respond to these direct assaults upon it. The realm of sexuality is not just one of radical natural diversity, where there are all these strange species and types of person, and there's no underlying logic or reason, natural cause, end, or purpose. As we omit things like reproduction from the discussion of the realm of sexuality and gender, we will realize that many of these things start to seem more, not necessarily commonsensical, but less objectionable. It seems that there's no reason really to object to these different sexualities, these gender expressions, if it's not really about anything, if there's not really any order to it, if they're not two halves of humanity that can be brought together in a loving relationship, there's an icon of the union of humanity as a whole, these things will not seem so objectionable. And so what we have increasingly is assaults upon the foundations of reality and then attacks at the surface as well. And we focus upon those attacks on the surface, but if we want to be effective, we need to think about the underlying assaults to what is thinkable and this challenge to make certain sins and certain errors, certain injustices, and certain forms of unreality thinkable. And they're made thinkable precisely because of this undermining of fundamental reality and our rootedness within it. Reproduction is the very last fact that a progressive, friendly society would like to admit. It's the spanner in the works of the vision of society and sexuality that we have. The fact of reproduction reveals that not all sexualities and identities are ambivalent or equivalent in their significance on the biological level. We can think about the ways that this reveals that there is a reason for relationships. And this reason is not just procreation in a very narrowly considered sense. This is the reproduction of society in the deeper and fuller sense, that we reproduce ourselves as communities, as people, as societies, and we carry on our life from generation to generation. The fundamental engine of human society, of human life, is seen in the union of man and woman. It's the icon of the joining together of the two halves of humanity. It's the means by which humanity's life is perpetuated and passed on. It is the fundamental division and union out of which other ones will arise. So we might think about the way that the relationship between the generations is one that is a second-order relationship that arises out of the relationship between man and woman, and the joining together of man and woman in marriage, and then also in the child that arises from that union. The way in which the joining together of man and woman is the context of natural hospitality for the child who arrives into the world. Think about the way that when you remove the centrality of that relationship, children come into the world increasingly as strangers, without a context where they are recognized as belonging. A couple that have a child in a context of a loving bond between them that might be protected by law, that might be protected by all these other sort of social structures, but fundamentally at its root level is a bond of love between two persons that on account of that fact is personalizing for those who come into it. We find it easier to recognize the personhood of a person born into that context than someone who comes into the world as a stranger, as someone who is born as a result of technological intervention and other sorts of legal arrangements. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't recognize the personhood of people in those situations, of children in those circumstances. But one of the reasons why we are able to recognize persons in the womb is because we recognize the personhood of that relationship between a man and a woman. That child is a loved person who represents the bond of love between that couple. Now, one of the reasons that abortion becomes thinkable is because we have lost that context, that personalizing context that enables us to see human beings as persons, which is to see human beings as they actually are. Increasingly, we are having this challenge to our way of seeing the world because we are not in contact with reality. As a fact, reproduction is essential to unlocking the scientific basis for all sorts of realities around gender, sexuality, identity, these sorts of things. As a fact, it causes deep problems for popular gender and sexuality theories, as it reveals that the realm of sexuality and gender is not just one of ambivalent diversity. At the very least, on the biological level, there are certain orientations and bodies that are natural in ways that others are not. And within the context of these debates, the word natural is highly contested. It's a word that presents certain things in a way that privileges them, and so for that reason it's objected to. The word natural here can be used in a very narrow sense, just in those things that occur in relationship to those things which refer to natural ends. And we can talk about natural in a looser sense, and it's often the way it's used, that there are things that are naturally occurring. There are some children that are born with an extra limb, for instance, or with an extra digit. And we could reason on that basis that it's natural to have 6 fingers on one of your hands instead of 4. You could have a situation where you have kids with some sort of deformity, and is that natural? Well, it occurs in nature, so in that sense it makes sense. But is it any more natural to have 5 digits on each hand and each foot? Or is it just more common? If we thought about human beings in this way, we might think about the statistical average, that the statistical average human being does not, in fact, have 5 digits on each hand and each foot. Rather, that's just more common. But we recognize that there is something of a purpose to the human body. There's something of a purpose to our human functions, and particularly in this case to sexuality and our identities as male and female. LGBTQ activists have long argued against arguments from the natural order, insisting that the fact that something is biologically natural doesn't settle the question of whether it is good socially, or what free individuals should be permitted to do in the privacy of their own homes. Yet the very telling thing is that people implicitly acknowledge the moral force that nature has in the arena of sexuality, when even opposing conservative appeals to nature, they invert the argument. They want to argue that these things are natural, even as they are opposing an argument from nature. The so-called appeal to nature fallacy is the claim that something is good and natural and good and morally binding because it occurs naturally, can often be inverted, this fallacy being increasingly popular among progressives, insisting that because something is deemed by society to be good, it must be regarded as every bit as natural as anything else. And those making such arguments may unwittingly be revealing the fact that despite their greatest attempts to escape it, nature still carries force in their thinking. They are still existing in God's creation. And as Cornelius von Til put it, they are like the child sitting on their father's lap, slapping him in the face. They can't escape the fact that they are situated in God's world, a world that operates according to God's rules. Loudly as they denounce their critics' use of the concept of nature, they themselves feel the force of that category of creation. They need to make appeal to it, or they need to attack established positions that certain realities are natural. This is important for us to recognize. We can often feel that we are besieged, that we are fighting on hostile territory, but we are not the ones fighting on hostile territory. The very reason that people need to make such oppressive laws is because they are fighting on hostile territory themselves. They are the ones who have to live in God's world when they are resisting the rules that he has established. They obviously believe that nature gives arguments some sort of genuine moral heft, and they have to escape that somehow. Despite themselves, they feel the need to make weak arguments in favor of radical diversity in human gender and sexuality in nature by referring to different sex systems of other species, for instance. The fact that the clownfish has unusual sexual relations does not actually tell us that much about how man and woman are supposed to relate to each other. The occurrence of sexual activities between animals of the same sex, or denying the existence of biological sex altogether, are not things that actually illumine nature that much. So much of the revisionist science and the oppressive laws on these subjects are a result of the fact that deep down, people know that nature and creation matters. Direct attempts to control the scientific and legal and social message around sexuality, to attack basic biological truths, to systematically obscure the great orienting fact of reproduction, of the bringing together of male and female in the union of marriage. And these are all to be expected. For all of the apparently assured claims and forceful attempts on the part of progressives to control the basic biological science of sex and to argue that sexuality accords to their rules, these things betray a very different reality. They cannot let nature alone because nature will not let them alone. There is essentially then here an antagonistic relationship with nature. And this antagonism is expressed on a great many fronts. The gender theories of figures like Judith Butler dissemble any natural reality behind societal structures of power. Nature is denied. Both gender and sex are merely stubborn social constructs with no rootedness in a deeper reality of creation. The fact that men and women are fairly instantly recognizable in their appearance, behavior, and reproductive activity in cultures all around the world and across human history is just an inconvenient fact that is largely ignored or disguised. Despite the many variations in the specific forms that it takes, a gender distinction between men and women is a human universal. If you were to be taken and randomly plopped into a society at any point in human history, at any place around the world, how long would it take you to work out who were men and who were women? Not long. Even if they switched places and dressed up before you arrived and tried to disguise themselves as the other, the truth would soon out. People are denying that what we are seeing is customary and conventional expressions of male and female nature. All of this is just a surface, a front, a veneer, a social construct. And so, for those progressives who cannot so easily deny nature's existence, nature will be directly attacked or circumvented. And I think this is what these sorts of laws represent. anything that would represent or speak or advocate for that reality that we all know is reality is going to be strongly attacked and proscribed. The feminist emancipation of women has been based in no small measure upon a contraceptive war against the natural functioning of women's bodies. This concern to break down the realities of men and women and just the gravity of our bodies, what our bodies mean, what our bodies do in relationship to each other. There are other examples of this where we have, for instance, xenofeminist movements and bio-trans feminism, these attempts to overcome the realities of women's bodies in order to establish a reality in which men and women are more and more interchangeable, have wombs outside of the body, have the reproduction of children just gradually moved away from women altogether and just occurring through technological means. The fundamental basis of women's oppression is seen to be in nature, and so we must overcome nature and conquer it by human power and technique. And so the circumvention of nature is pursued in all sorts of ways. We can think about the way that two fathers can have a baby with IVF and surrogacy, and increasingly through some sorts of creating gametes from stem cells and things like that, you could have an infant that has two fathers biologically with the technological circumvention. The natural restriction of reproductive potential to male and female couples represents an injustice that must be rectified by science. And so what we need to recognize is that the very root of things like same-sex marriage, about transgenderism, there is a transhumanist root that will play out increasingly over coming decades. We will see that being played out in increasingly oppressive assaults upon the logic of male and female in society, and also attempts to circumvent and overcome our natures. The war against nature and the knowledge of nature will only become fiercer in the years to come. In our day, progressivism is a force that is fundamentally opposed to nature, not merely ambivalent or indifferent to it. It's founded in no small measure upon denying the core anthropological truth that we see in Scripture, that man is male and female. That humanity is male and female is a truth from which social orders we've seen, the bodily union of male and female in marriage being the seed of the family and the societal structure that provides the basis for. Human time, the movement from generation to generation through the gift of bodies. Social polarity in two forms of humanity that are situated differently within the life of the species. And the nature of the self all derive. The knowledge of nature and its power must either be actively ideologically suppressed or technologically subdued or subverted in accordance with the definition of humanity as indifferently different, autonomous individuals. Irrespective of the sex, the idea is that choice is all important. It depends upon what you want to define yourselves as. However, people cannot just ignore nature's witness because they cannot escape it. A very powerful quote from a famous essay, The Power of the Powerless, written by one of the communist dissidents called Václav Havel. I'm probably pronouncing his name incorrectly. He talks about the fact that this situation where a greengrocer puts up a sign within the window of his store reading, "Workers of the world unite." And he talks about the way that the greengrocer means this action. Why does he do it? What is he trying to communicate to the world? Is he genuinely enthusiastic about the idea of unity among the workers of the world? Is his enthusiasm so great that he feels an irrepressible impulse to acquaint the public with his ideals? Has he really given more than a moment's thought to how such a unification might occur and what it might mean? I think it can safely be assumed that the overwhelming majority of shopkeepers never think about the slogans they put out in their windows, nor do they use them to express their real opinions. That poster was delivered to our greengrocer from the enterprise headquarters, along with the onions and the carrots. He put them all into the window simply because it has been done that way for years, because everyone does it. and because that is the way it has to be. If he were to refuse, there could be trouble. He could be reproached for not having the proper decoration in his window. Someone might even accuse him of disloyalty. He does it because these things must be done if one is to get along in life. He does it. It is one of the thousands of details that guarantee him a relatively tranquil life in harmony with society, as they say. Obviously, the greengrocer is indifferent to the semantic content of the slogan on exhibit. He does not put the slogan in his window from any personal desire to acquaint the public with the ideal it expresses. This, of course, does not mean that his action has no motive or significance at all, or that the slogan communicates nothing to anyone. The slogan is really a sign, and as such, it contains a subliminal but very definite message. Verbally, it might be expressed this way: I, the greengrocer XY, live here, and I know what I must do. I behave in the manner expected of me. I can be depended upon, and am above reproach. I am obedient, and therefore I have the right to be left in peace. This message, of course, has an addressee. It is directed above to the greengrocer's superior, and at the same time, it is the shield that protects the greengrocer from potential informers. The slogan's real message, meaning, therefore, is rooted firmly in the greengrocer's existence. It reflects his vital interests. But what are those vital interests? Let us take note. If the greengrocer had been instructed to display the slogan, I am afraid and therefore unquestionably obedient, he would not be nearly as indifferent to its semantics. Even though the statement would reflect the truth, the greengrocer would be embarrassed and ashamed to put such an unequivocal statement of his own degradation in the shop window. And quite naturally so, for he is a human being and thus has a sense of his own dignity. To overcome this complication, his expression of loyalty must take the form of a sign which, at least on the textual surface, indicates a level of disinterested conviction. It must allow the greengrocer to say, what's wrong with the workers of the world uniting? Thus, his sign helps the greengrocer to conceal from himself the low foundations of his obedience, at the same time concealing the low foundations of power. It hides them behind the facade of something high, and that something is ideology. And we need to be under no illusions. Such ideologies exist in our day and age, and we're increasingly seeing people in all areas of society falling in line with them. People know deep down, like the greengrocer, that these things are not true, that the things being said about sexuality and gender and what it means to be man and woman are not, in fact, the case, that reality itself testifies against them. Their slogans may not be those of the old communist ideologies, but new ones that declare, for instance, sexuality is a spectrum, gender is merely a social construct, or your sex is whatever you believe yourself to be. People don't have to believe this ideology, just cooperate with it. And increasingly what we're seeing is the people who will put out that sign on their desk, for instance, with the pride flag, or they'll have some statement in their car window, whatever it is. They may not actually believe that. They may not hold it deep down. For many, increasingly, they will start to bring their feelings and beliefs into line with it. But deep down, many people know that there's something off about this. That it's not entirely right, that there's something wrong. What do we need to do in response to all of this? When we see these sorts of statements, when we realize that people are holding this false ideology and belief about what it means to be man and woman. So often we can take this medicinal approach. We attack the errors and false beliefs and false statements directly. And increasingly we find ourselves driven back, defending ever more extreme positions. The idea that there might be such a thing as man and woman is, we should not be driven back to defending that. Reality itself testifies to that fact. And the more that we find ourselves defending that sort of claim, the more actually we can give credence, by virtue of arguing with it, to the legitimacy, or at least the thinkableness, that there might not be such a thing as man and woman. What should we do in response? Well, I think one of the most important things that we need to do is recognize the importance of solid food. If you're going to deal with the errors of these poisons introduced into society, you do so by feeding yourself and by rooting yourself in deepest reality. mixing metaphors a bit there, but we root ourselves in reality and we feed ourselves upon reality. We take it deeply into ourselves and we live in terms of it. One of the dangers that the church always faces is to take its opponents as those that are the foil against which it reads the scriptures. Its primary reading of the scriptures is to respond to this, that, and the other error out there, playing sort of whack-a-mole with heresy and with error. But yet we respond to error best when we root ourselves in and express reality most fully and truth. And so what do? We feed ourselves on solid food of Scripture, not just on medicine. One of the things I've realized in the course of writing a book, a long-delayed book, I'm sorry about this, but it is still coming, on the theology of man and woman, is that so much of the debate is fixated on the arguments, the things that are controversial. And many of those things that are controversial are not things that should be controversial. These are things that are clearly revealed in Scripture, but the more that people focus upon winning the arguments, having that proof text, having that knockdown argument that can either provide ammunition against the other side or defend yourself from the attacks of the other side, the more they miss all the parts of Scripture that speak and illumine us on what it means to be man and woman in far more subtle ways, that aren't providing us with ammunition or defense, but with very subtle guidance, but deep and rich guidance. If you're looking for medicine, you want something strong and effective, but yet health is provided primarily through a wide diet. And many of those things will only have their effect over many meals. If you find yourself suffering from malnutrition, it can be something that's built up over a long period of being without some element of your diet. And in the same way, when we feel this sort of malnutrition, often what we're feeling is the result of not having a deep grounding in and feeding upon truth. And so what we need in response is this solid diet. We need to think about the whole of the Scriptures, not just fixating upon the various poisons and errors that we need to respond to and having medicinal responses, but having that solid food of Scripture. You'll find if you read books on sexuality in the church, you'll have very little that's said about texts like Song of Songs. Now, why is that? Of all the texts in Scripture that might seem to speak to the relationship between a man and woman, Song of Songs would seem to be it. But yet the very fact that it does not seem to speak directly into our current conflicts and debates means that it's left out. Likewise, the way in which the story of Scripture is so oriented about the reality of male and female can get forgotten. We forget the fact, for instance, that the whole story of Genesis constantly returns to themes like the opening of wombs and circumcision. I mean, why have those realities central if there is not some fundamental truth to male and female that is at the heart of the biblical story, that is the heart of creational reality? This failure to pay attention to fundamental reality, this failure to root ourselves in deep truth, and our preoccupation with attacking error has led to disorientation. And we struggle as a result. Our heads get turned around when we're actually engaging with some of these people who say that sex is just a social construct, who say that you can define yourself however you want. I mean, what difference does it make? If you have not grounded yourself in truth, if you have not fed deeply upon truth, you will struggle to respond to that effectively. And so as Christians, our most powerful response to error is grounding ourselves in Scripture, feeding deeply upon Scripture, not primarily seeking to have responses to this, that, and the other error, but speaking forcefully and effectively about the truth. When you think about a bill like Bill C4, what it is doing is attacking that expression of truth, attacking anything that might remind people of fundamental reality, of creation, of the reality that we're all inhabiting, whether we like it or not. And we need to recognize that whether people like it or not, they are inhabiting this reality. They may have all these laws, they might have all of these ways of technological circumvention of reality, all these ways to provide a sort of prophylactic against reality, but yet they are in reality, like it or not. We have reality on our side. We have creation on our side. And as we root ourselves in the words of the God who created us, and as we speak those words as witnesses to the world, as we remind people of this creation, not as those who are trying to win an argument that we feel that we're on the back foot and we need to defend ourselves, but pointing at the reality that they are inhabiting and saying, look, it's there, you know it's there. We are reminding them of the world that they are inhabiting, that they are slapping their father's face while they're sitting in his lap. We cannot escape that reality. They cannot escape that reality. And as we remind ourselves and others of this truth, we'll find ourselves having a much greater confidence when facing such errors. I think we have a few moments for any questions or... Yeah. I think a lot of it arises from people like Foucault and Judith Butler. Judith Butler's work on sort of trans identities, I think, is a very important part of the picture. And then Foucault and others who present humanity itself as something that is more contestable, that we can think about humanity being formed in different ways in different societies, and fundamentally that there is no deeper down there. Ultimately, you can think about things purely in terms of power structures, that there is no underlying truth or reality. Now, those sorts of theories are increasingly, I think, what we find is we're dealing with those theories downstream, not dealing with them necessarily in their root form, but dealing with them as they've been sort of passed through. I'm trying to remember, it's like a game of ideological telephone, where we encounter them in extreme and caricatured forms. There are far more subtle theories that you'll find if you actually read these thinkers themselves, but they're upstream from that. I think the other thing that we need to recognize is that many of these things are not actually primarily encountered in the form of ideas, but just in lived experience. If you spend a lot of your time online in virtual reality, you just don't feel the gravity of reality in the same way. And I think that is where we're feeling many of these things taking root. Transhumanism is felt as people can escape the gravity of reality. So when people talk about transgender identities, I think online communities are a very important part of the way in which people are being led into those. In large part because people form imaginary identities. They identify with animals, they identify with particular characters in TV shows and things like that, and develop whole virtual realities out of these. And as a result, their rootedness in reality can often be quite attenuated. They're not feeling their bodies, and they feel alienated from their bodies. And as a result, they start to pursue different sorts of sexual identities, different sorts of kinks, or whatever it is. I think that is a lot of what we're dealing with. And that's not primarily an ideological problem. It's a problem of people just not, to use the slang, touching grass enough. Yeah, in some ways I'm trying to work on a Protestant equivalent to that, but I think increasingly there is a recognition that we need to root our response in a deep grasp of creation. I think people recognize that it's like an immune system in some ways. One of the examples I think of, is like your skin. Your skin protects you from being in an unsterile environment. If you didn't have a skin, you would either succumb to all the things within your environment, or you'd be in a constant immune reaction and fight against it, or you'd need to sterilize your environment, or you'd need to separate yourself from your environment. And what I'm trying to encourage, and I think someone like Pope John Paul was trying to encourage, was a sense of the homeostatic order of Christian truth and reality. That as we ground ourselves and root ourselves in that, we are protected within an unsterile environment. We don't have to feel constantly on our guard against every error and issue out there in our society, because when you're well protected by an understanding of the truth, you're just not anxious about those things to the same extent, because you have that protection in your groundedness in the truth. And so I think a recovery of nature is something that is occurring at the moment. I think people are recognizing in various quarters, part of it is a recognition that our debates have not come like a bolt from the blue. The reason we are discussing these issues here and now is because of far-reaching social changes that have occurred beforehand. And the ways in which we've been alienated from ourselves now cause some of the struggles that we're experiencing. And until we get back to that point, recognize where these problems arise from, we're just going to be playing this game of whack-a-mole otherwise. And the other thing is that until you recognize those problems and those forms of alienation, often what you're trying to do is maintain a sort of facade when everything else is crumbling behind it. I think that's one of the problems that we can face with man and woman in relationship and community that has largely erased the difference between man and woman and the dignity that they have and the ways in which life can be oriented about that reality. And we're trying to avoid that while maintaining a picture on the surface that there is some sort of difference. And so until we find some way to get back to a more fundamental grasp of reality and ordering of society around that, I think we'll end up with people feeling that there is an alienation between something about themselves and their experience in community. And I think that's an experience that many women have had, for instance, in Christian communities, where they feel that, on the one hand, the Bible teaches all of these things about men and women, but the more that they practice that within modern society, the more they feel alienated from dignity, from participation in society, things like that. And so we need, I think, to get back to a more fundamental grasp of Scripture, of reality in terms of it, and then try and not just have a nice facade, but try and build everything upon that and recognize where, when things have gone awry, the alienation that we feel has arisen from that. Yes, there's. I could get. If you give me if you send me an email, I can send you a link to the. Yep. If you send me an email, I can give you a link to the material. But it's worth reading through the bill and other things associated with it, because it really is quite far-reaching. One of the things I think can help us in thinking about that is the way that Scripture, when we read Genesis chapters 1 and 2, it does not primarily give us a prescriptive approach to male and female. It tells us this is just the way that things are. This is the way that God has created things. When you recognize the way that God has created things, you don't feel, first of all, that you're in a fight trying to defend a certain set of rules against other sets of rules. You recognize this is the way that reality works, And we want to work in terms of that reality and in tune with it. And once that's been recognized, I think you'll also want not just to focus upon rules and roles, but to actually think about how does this organically work out from the way that God has created us. So for instance, Scripture does not say that the man should be the head. Scripture says the man is the head. And as a result, you don't need to always assert your headness, as it were, to kind of force that fact. It's just a fact within reality. And so you need to work in terms with it, with the grain of reality, not trying to resist that, but not, on the other hand, trying to have a sort of performative gender identity, which is increasingly what we see within our society, where people are trying to exert some identity to protect the fact that there's nothing behind it. I think that's often the facade approach, that people want to create an appearance where the reality has been forgotten. I think we've gone over time, but... Thank you.
Did you ever see the movie My Big Greek Wedding?
Many years ago, yes.
You remember the comment about the man being the head and what the wife
Yep.
said? Neck.
Yep.